Welcome back to the King's Hall. We've got a little bit of a different episode here. Before we jump in, if you're new here, weird that you're listening to this episode first.
I'm actually not new here.
But Eric Kahn, say hi to the guests.
Hey.
Welcome to the King's Hall. What is Dresden Bunk's shoulder? Say hi to the guests.
Look at Dan's face. I wish people could see the look on Dan's face. So even before this show, Dan, you and I were getting warmed up.
We had a spirited conversation.
Yeah, we may or may not have gotten in a little tiff. The thing is,
Dan got in a tiff. I didn't.
Oh! It's continuing.
Dan, it's a joke.
I can't decide whether I'm going to quit the King's Hall or if I'm just going to fire you guys.
Oh.
Well, you're the president.
Oh.
Brian, I will pay you $10,000 to vote with me to fire Eric.
Eric is worth more than 10 grand to me. But 15?
Done.
I'm just kidding.
There's only one right way, Dan, to settle this, and that's fisticuffs. Brian, what?
You would
What
have
is
to punch
happening?
up. It's really to a disadvantage.
Gentlemen, everybody, welcome back. Sometimes in the King's Hall, sparks fly. Sometimes there's misunderstandings. But
Because we're kings. We have swords.
Kings get over it. Kings answer listener questions.
Yes.
And that's what we're doing today. Here in the King's Hall, we decided that, we get quite a few questions from all of the various media. Media already is plural. It's plural of medium, as we discovered last week.
You learned that, yeah.
I learned that from Eric Kahn last week. So from all of our various channels, we get lots of questions through over the weeks, and we realized that we were dumb. We should do a Q&A episode. We should take some of these questions. So we put out a call on our Signal group, our Patreon Signal group. We put out a call on the Twitter, and we said, what questions do you guys have from the first season so far of the King's Hall? We figured this would be a way to figure out how you guys are reacting to what we're saying, what we've maybe been unclear about, where we can get even more practical. And so we're going to be going through some of these questions and doing our best to answer them. Some of them, I'm going to be honest with you, I don't think are 100% serious. For example, J. Chase Davis asked biblical inseam length for shorts on men. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it should be probably between, I'd say 9 inches above the knee. So whatever is, if you've seen South Africans or Rhodesians in shorts, I think anything longer than that is actually sinful.
Inappropriate.
It's actually sinful.
Wow, okay.
It's rebellion against God.
So this is an example of the kind of content that we're going to be bringing to you. Today, someone also asked, why does Brian Sauvé have a premium Pornhub account? That was Nancy Morris. And answer, Nancy, I actually don't. So I apologize.
Thank you for your question.
Yeah, thank you for your honest question. Wasn't loaded at all. Musculus also asked, why are you gay? To which Thomas Jefferson responded, who says I'm gay? And I love the internet. I screenshotted that. So thank you. Thank you.
Gay.
Thank you, gentlemen. But let's get into some real questions here. And the first question from Brian of Alexandria on Twitter. He asked, tell us the story of the journey of Reformation your church has gone on. You guys speak often of all the changes over the last years. And any advice you have for pastors who are trying to shepherd in similar ways and directions. So I thought maybe Dan...
Actually, I think this is a good question for me.
I think
having not been here.
Yeah, that's a good point. The main Reformation was Eric Kahn moved here at one point, and that just changed everything. Yeah, what did that look like for our church? And any advice for pastors, even specifically, who are trying to shepherd in similar ways?
Oh, man, how far back do you go? All right.
Exactly.
Once upon a time in a land of mountains and snow. Under the stars. No, I'm just kidding.
It's like the new cold open.
Yeah. So our church has undergone quite the transformation. So when Brian took over as the primary teaching pastor some years ago, long time ago now, the church was actually a Calvary Chapel church. So
Brian had just turned 13.
Yeah, 13 and a half.
Well, you say that, but it was like 20. So, I mean, it really wasn't.
Technically, I was 25 at this point.
Oh, okay.
Or no, 24. I was going to be 25 in 2 months.
Yeah, you want to tell the story? No, I'm just kidding.
I don't.
So Brian took over the church as the primary teaching pastor of the church. And we were Calvary Chapel, so charismatic, dispensational, Arminian to some degree. And Brian was teaching verse by verse, serial expositional preaching. Great. We love that, type of preaching.
Yeah.
Through the book of Genesis, gets to the end of Genesis, and Joseph says to his brothers, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. And from that point on, the dominoes started to fall. Brian led the elder team into Calvinism. I was mostly there. A lot of us were mostly there.
Yeah.
Because of the Young, Restless, and Reformed movement anyway. Mm-hmm. And my influences growing up with John Piper, the church that I grew up in, was just 90 miles from Bethlehem Baptist Church.
Just for people who are wondering, because I actually wasn't familiar with this, what is Calvary's, default position with Calvinism?
Hostile?
Okay.
Yeah.
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 Typically.
And I can't speak for them where they are now.
Okay.
Because we left a long time ago.
I had just heard maybe like 10 years ago, I had heard a Calvary pastor, he more or less equated it with heresy. So I didn't know if that was indicative of, broader movement or if it was just...
You had a divide. There was a debate even around that time. Basically, you're in the midst of the Young Restless Reformed movement, and there's this big debate. Should Calvary Chapel be Calvinist-friendly or Calvinist-free? Like, do we want to kick them all out, or do we want to be friendly to them?
Okay.
Even like, we're not going to have them as pastors, but for example, and this is funny that this was the controversy. I remember it. There was a big controversy that Costa Mesa was going to invite Ed Stetzer to speak at a conference, and he's a Calvinist, which is really funny. Like, he was way too...
He was too much?
Yeah, too much.
Oh, wow.
So there was a big debate, but generally not pleased. Very dispensational and very, very hostile to the term, probably Calvinist or Arminian, to be honest. They would
Really?
say more like, we're not either.
Are they, and I'm sorry to interrupt Dan's story, but are they no creed but the Bible folks? Or do they assent to any creeds?
I'm sure you get all flavors because they
Yeah.
claim not to be a denomination, but they have like doctrinal standards. So you're going to find variations throughout. So anyway, from the point of reforming, that point, many dominoes fell as far as theological convictions to lead to where we are now. The difficult part, though, was leading people through these changes.
Yes.
And so a lot of the people that were attending the church did not have the same theological convictions that we did. And so they had joined a different church.
Mm-hmm.
And now it was different. This is the hard part about changing a church, is that you have people that they signed up. There's no membership in Calvary Chapel, but they're members of the church. And the doctrinal standards of the church and the teaching all changed.
Yeah.
And so we had many, many years of turnover in the church and have since essentially replanted, an entirely new church in that time. So there are very few people that are still here from the original church. It's very difficult work.
Yeah.
It's very hard on leadership and on the sheep.
Yeah.
To make changes. Any changes at all are very difficult. You hear the trope about like arguing over the carpet color. Well, that's a real thing. Anytime there's change, people have to be shepherded through that. And ultimately, most people decided that they weren't going to follow us on that.
And part of that as well is you have to be aware as a leader of your capital that every time you're asking somebody to follow you somewhere that they are not, you're asking them to follow you because they're not there yet. You're saying, come over here with me.
Trust me.
Yeah, you're taking a withdrawal out of a bank account. You're writing a check. And the thing is, if you don't have enough money in the account, it bounces. And so, you can be sympathetic with people who left over
Absolutely.
the years because I'm 24, 25,
Some left
26,
better
27.
than others, but
Yeah, there was sin for sure. And there's been lessons learned for us as well. But a lot of those people were like, yeah, I don't trust this pastor. I don't trust these guys. I don't believe this. I think some tips, you do want to make sure that you're right. Obviously, you want to make sure that you're biblically convinced, that you're prepared to argue for the position that you believe is biblical. Let's say you're like, we're going to get rid of kids ministry and family integrate, which we think you should do. You're going to write a check. Well, think about all the different ways that you can communicate about that you can win. You're trying to win the people. And so
it's really not that hard to win an argument once you
Yeah.
figure out that you do have the high ground
Yeah.
on some of these things. But it is really, really difficult to win the person.
Yep.
That's the hard part. Because you can give the most sound theological, biblical, scriptural, backing for your
Yeah.
argument, and they just don't like you. I mean, or whatever it is. If you
Yeah.
don't win their heart,
Don't respect
and
you.
And so, as far as advice, this is a daunting task, and it is genuinely very difficult, and it is very noble work to do the work of reformation in a church that already exists. But do not overestimate your ability to be able to convince anybody of anything.
Correct.
And I mean, I don't mean to sound like a downer, but try to change somebody's mind on some of these theological things is very, very difficult.
Yep.
I think one of the things that I noticed in coming here too, though, is that you guys had, first of all, each other,
Mm-hmm.
and then eventually worked to create an elder board that was united.
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm curious your thoughts. One of the mistakes I see a lot of pastors make is they may not even be the lead pastor in their church, and they're like, "Oh yeah, I'm going to reform this church," and they don't have any support from leadership. Maybe like one person in the church. Sort of like if you're going to sail the sea, the winds also have to be right. Like some
Yep.
things have to go your way. How big of a thing was it to, like, Brian, to have Dan helping push with you, because you guys were going the same direction?
Yeah, it wouldn't have worked without Dan, without know.
Don't blame me.
It's all Dan's fault. It's all Dan's fault. No, it did require having people on your side. Even though we said the whole church turned over for the most part. That was a process of several years. So you can weather that only if you have people with you, and only if the church is continuing to function and be and do what a church is supposed to be and do. I'm not saying like we dropped the bomb, everybody left the next week, and then we just said, well, here we are. No, we were pastoring people through this whole thing. Not all of it was about, there's the normal pastoral stuff going on. But if not for the fact, the first thing I told the elder team actually was, I'm convinced of this doctrine. I'd like to discuss it with you guys. And if you can refute it and show that I'm incorrect, I will, of course, change my mind. I'll go back. I'll retreat and say I was wrong. But I also said I'll leave if you'd like me to. If the elders say that we're not that church, we're not willing to consider that, I would have willingly stepped down and said, that's fine. I can't preach in good conscience here because I'm convinced that I can't preach through whole books of the Bible. And then like every time something related to soteriology comes up, be like, and I'm going to recuse myself from this text, kind of wouldn't work.
Yeah.
So I think it's important, like to your point, Eric, that you have to be willing to admit when you shouldn't try to reform something and when you should actually peaceably separate and go somewhere else. Even if you're the pastor. Like if you look at your church, and our church had a tumultuous and short history before this. Okay, if it was a different story, and I was the 5th generation pastor in a long line of Calvary chapels with a well-established everybody's Calvary chapel, it would have been actually probably sinful of me to come in there and blow the thing up over something like that. If you're in an SBC church, it's always been an SBC church, and all of a sudden you're like, I would like to be a confessionally Westminster confession church.
You should just go.
You should just go. You should
yeah.
really just leave. It's not fair to that church that's been built by multiple generations of people. It was, honestly, it was an unusual circumstance in our church. I'll say that, unusual circumstance due to our region, the demographics of our region in terms of its Christian population, the history of our church, the planting pastor having disqualified himself from ministry early on, leaving a pretty tumultuous lot of new converts who weren't like Calvary Chapel to the core. They were new converts who just happened to be saved in the midst of this work. And then just a ton of our people were Calvinists too already. Like a good number of them were Calvinists because of the influence of people like Mark Driscoll. So I would say for a lot of guys, you should be very, very slow to try to, especially to the degree that you are a one guy.
Was there a point, Dan, where because like Brian's saying, you wouldn't normally counsel somebody to go through that much change in that short a time.
Yeah.
But there can be reasons that it's a good idea to do so. Was there a point when you just realized, look, we are having a lot of change. We just need to, we realize where we're going. We just need to hit that mark. I think recently even we were talking about that with being dual practice between Credo and
we're going to get there too.
Yeah. So again, the rate of change.
Yeah,
I guess
the pace
speak
of
to
change
that.
is really important.
Yeah.
So like Brian was saying, you have a certain amount of like capital in your account, trust with the people. And anytime that you have a change, you're withdrawing on that account. And it is important to have a slower pace. And looking back, having the benefit of hindsight, there are some things where I would have moved slower and some things I would have gone faster.
Absolutely.
In moving.
Yeah.
Because of convictions, in especially the liturgy and things like that. But the point is, anytime you're leading anything, even your family, something like that, and you're going to make these changes, one of the worst ways that you can lead, unless you're talking about like wholesale repentance, you were in unrepentant sin and you need to turn to righteousness. I just mean like in management, especially in direction of leadership, is to just change everything all at the same time. You're almost guaranteed to really screw things up.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody says like, oh, you're a 500-pound morbidly obese person with all of these diseases. You know what you should do is not take any medication. You should fast and start trying to do a marathon. Like that'd be really dumb.
You should try to run a marathon tomorrow.
Yeah. So
you will die.
So there you go.
You will die.
Yeah, the pace of change is really important. But like Brian said, our situation is not normal.
Yeah, it wasn't normal.
Because our church was so new and there was so much turnover already because of the disqualification of the planting pastor who had a very strong personality, very strong orating, rhetorical gifts.
Yes.
And so he attracted a lot of people because of his personality and his giftings.
Yeah.
And then when he was disqualified and removed, a lot of people left anyway because they wanted him back, and so you didn't have stable foundations anyway.
No.
And so it wasn't a healthy church when Brian took over because the guy who had been part of the succession plan ultimately didn't want to be the lead pastor and left to do missions. So anyway, it's just a really messy story.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't wish it on anybody.
And some of those previous pastors actually ended up calling me and being like, we wouldn't have left you in charge if we had known that you were going to make the church Calvinist. And I was like, well, you probably shouldn't have committed adultery. At that point, it's kind of that sort of situation. So there comes a point, I identify strongly with Pastor Doug Wilson in his story of, they were a kind of a normal Baptist church. And he was, from what I understand, he was the guy with the guitar. Like he led worship. And then for whatever reason, the pastor kind of said, I'm out. Good luck. And then he was the last guy standing. And like subsequently over the years became a Calvinist and post-millennialist, became, and all these different things he became, and the church went with him. And I can't think of many other examples other than Christ Church and our church that have had that progression, because both circumstances started with something crazy and not ideal.
and a lot of what you see in the mainstream is actually the opposite direction. Like churches are changing, but they're drifting.
They're drifting towards wokeness.
Yeah, and here we are saying like,
institutional rot. So you have to, if you're going to do any sort of reform work, the Lord will provide this over the years if you stick it out, but you have to have a spine, you have to have a thick skin. You have to be willing to hear people that loved you 10 minutes ago say, I don't respect you.
You're a cult leader.
Yes.
You've ruined the church.
And not just like this is used to be in the past. I mean, this was like just this week, Dan told me about someone who had left our church and said, yeah, one of their main things was they don't respect you. And I was like, okay, all right.
And that was only part of the 3-hour conversation. So
you got to get used to these things. So it's like you have to have a spine, you have to have a target, and you have to read the situation. Don't try to be the maverick guy that's like going in and blowing up a church that is basically healthy and established in its doctrine, and you're in there and you're just like a guy that's swinging a hammer. Well, I mean, on the one hand, you're probably not going to accomplish much anyway, but you're probably actually being illegitimate. You wouldn't want somebody to come into your church that's established, like let's say our church, someone came in and they said, this church needs to become Arminian, we'd be like, no.
Scram.
We'd say no. So related to this, a question we got many times when we called for questions was, and this is specifically from KR Occidental Localist. He said, I want the story of how each of you moved from Baptist to Presbyterian theology. I don't think I've ever heard any of you tell your story. Maybe the process of how Refuge transitioned from 1689 to CREC. We're not actually in the CREC, but I get what they mean because we have a dual practice. CREC allows multiple confessions. And he says, no, this isn't just nosiness. This is personally relevant to me and my wife, to which Matt Carabini said, I concur, but actually I do want to hear out of nosiness. So, Eric, well, because we were all Baptists.
Yeah, so I went to the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky, and was talking about this recently on Twitter. A lot of the reason I got into Reformed theology and the old Reformers, old dead Puritans and stuff like that, was because of John Piper. His preaching, it was expositional, obviously, had Reformed tinges to it, is what I would say now.
Yeah.
So I went to Southern Seminary, not really understanding those categories, and just in the process of being there, got exposed to what I would say is like actual Reformed theology, but also Reformed ecclesiology. So one of the things I started to realize that was if like I was at the time, if I was a Reformed Baptist, I was basically adopting Reformed soteriology, but not ecclesiology, which can be done. Obviously, there are good brothers who do that. What I became increasingly uncomfortable with in my own life were really looking at, okay, my soteriology is here, but all these guys that I love shared very, very different views on the church and how the church, including like worship and what should be going on in the church. So I started reading that. And like many people, like if you're switching from Arminianism to Calvinism or, Baptist to Presbyterian, this is a process, right? So we were really wrestling with issues. One of the things that got me though was we were in a Baptist church, and I'm reading all this covenant theology, and my oldest son is like 3.5 maybe, and we're taking communion. And he reaches for the communion tray, and he says to me, Daddy, why not me? And I said, well, you've got to be a Christian. And he said, I believe in Jesus. I believe Jesus died for my sins, in a 3-year-old kind of way. And that really got me thinking, like, what do we do about these kids? Because at Southern, we weren't just, there's a lot of Reformed Baptists now, even the guys in our church, like they're typically baptizing pretty young.
And they're also very comfortable with, even before
like children's
I was
profession
a
of
Paedo
faith.
Baptist, you would hear me preach. People would say, "Are you a Presbyterian?" Because I would preach very strongly about the inclusion of our children in this visible church thing, and that Paul says that they're holy, and they are in there's a different category seemingly that they are in than the children of pagans. And at that time, I explained it in more of through a more of a Baptistic way. But I was saying a lot of the same thing because I thought those were clear to me in Scripture. But go ahead.
Yeah, so that really got me thinking about children, the covenant. What do we do with these issues? And I know people have gotten upset with me for saying this, but I feel like when I was in the Baptist camp, we always tended to strawman Presbyterians. So even in seminary, I remember asking a professor, I said, so what is the Presbyterian view on this? And they would say things like, well, they believe that baptism is baptismal regeneration.
Yeah, and you're like, well, actually.
And now I look back and I'm like, that's really not a fair...
That's not the Presbyterian view.
No, that's not a fair assessment of what the Presbyterian view is at all. So anyway, I started looking into this. By God's providence, I found Community Pres in Louisville. Bill Smith was there. He is pastoring. He's now in the CREC in Illinois, Carbondale. And I think it was so helpful for me because Bill had been, I think, in the SBC. He was Baptist. And he had made the transition So he was really helpful in answering a lot of questions, being patient. The issue that sealed it, I'm reading to 1,000 Generations, but the issue that sealed it for me was, so I'd been in these Baptist churches, and like we would not commune an infant baptized person.
Okay.
Like you cannot be a member of our church. You have
Come to the table.
Illegitimate baptism. Like it's an absolute, we're dividing over that issue.
Sure.
And I said to Bill, I said, well, I don't know. I don't think I'm a Paedo-Baptist at this point. I know you probably won't let me be a member at your church. And he looked at me funny, and he was like, basically starts repeating the creed, and the Nicene Creed. He said, do you believe these things? I was like, yeah, I believe all that. He's like, welcome. Welcome to the Lord's table. Welcome to membership. Like, you can't be an elder.
Sure.
You can't be a teaching elder. But that changed things for me, because I thought it was the first time I'd ever heard somebody say, yeah, we shouldn't excommunicate people for their view on baptism, is what that amounted to. Anyway, long story short, we continued digging, reading. All my kids were baptized. We were practicing Paedo communion eventually as well. It's pretty natural that leads you into the CREC, which we had been part of. That's what I was doing pastoral ministry work in, and then now here. So.
Yep.
Daniel,
What about you, Dan?
You want me to tell the whole story, huh?
However you feel led. Let's go back to our Calvary Chapel.
How do I feel led?
Dan, how do you feel led? Okay, no, that's you're not being led by the Spirit right now.
I actually brought a shofar today.
Out of all of the things that Brian and I have argued over, nothing have we argued over more than covenant theology as it relates to baptism. I mean, for years. And hours. And we would take competing positions, as naturally would occur between Brian and I as we argue.
Yeah.
We can't come to an agreement right away. We must fight.
This is how it's done.
Yeah.
You got to test a view. You got to see, can I defend this view?
Anthony Esselin calls this the agon, right? You have to wrestle and fight with ideas.
Yeah, and how can you do that other than saying, tell me why I'm wrong?
Yeah.
And I'm going to tell you why you're wrong. And we're probably not going to agree at the end of 3 hours, but over some time, you do start to, I think, test and prove out different arguments and disprove other ones.
Yeah, so, the story is quite messy, simply because it took so many years, 3 years probably, to come to these convictions completely, enough to the point where you're like, no, I must act on them. And it all is introduced from covenant theology and the nature of the covenants, and how they operate. And so, that was really the entry into paedobaptism. It's just the nature of the covenants. Then there's also some things like, reading the distinctiveness of Baptist covenant theology. Who wrote that?
Pascal Denault, a book originally written in French, since translated to English in multiple editions. And it's one of the better books that you can read.
It's a good book.
To understand a critique of Paedo-Baptist Presbyterian covenant theology over against a particular Baptist covenant theology.
Yeah, and so one of the strongest arguments, I think, from that book against paedobaptism was the argument that what is the newness of the new covenant? How does one enter the new covenant? And it is by new birth. And so when I read that, I'm like, okay, I'm satisfied for a time. And then I kept chewing on it. And I'm like, but there are some passages that don't seem to talk like that. They don't seem to talk like that, especially the apostasy passages seem to be particularly troublesome. And I know there's 1689ers that I respect you guys. I don't have any.
All of the things we're going to bring up, Renahan or Dr. White or Pascal Denault or a lot of you guys could come up with very compelling, biblically coherent answers to, and I understand that. There's a reason that this is still a debate.
Welcome and come to the table.
Yeah, we love you. We're not, we are really not, I'm answering this question, we got it a lot. We're not interested in an intramural fight. And I think you'll see that by the end in how we describe where our church is right now.
I would just interject, one of the reasons that I think we have been friends with and appreciated what was going on in the CREC, of course I was in it for a long time, is because we could say, look, you have two camps, Both brothers love you.
Yeah.
Welcome. We don't think this is an issue to divide our churches over.
Right.
And you're Christians, we're Christians.
Yeah.
These are both orthodox positions.
Yes. Yeah. Sorry, Dan. I interrupted you, then Eric interrupted you, and now.
Yeah, start talking so I can interrupt you again.
You know what's really funny is I saw multiple comments about that, and I didn't even notice. It's just normal amongst our conversations. But anyway, so there, I was saying like there are certain problem passages or passages that are problematic for that view. And again, I'm sure that there's scholars that could give an answer that would be satisfying to them. It wasn't to me. And that's particularly like John 15.
Yeah.
Where he, Jesus is saying, he who abides in me will bear much fruit. And if anyone does not abide in me, he is thrown away like a branch and withers, and the branches are gathered and thrown into the fire and burned. And so thinking about that, like there are branches that are grafted into this vine, which is Christ. They're connected to Christ somehow, and they don't produce fruit. And so they're thrown away. They're broken off.
Right.
And so just in Dan, really simple, not a professional scholarly theologian, I look at that and just the sniff test, like the blue collar, like, what does that mean? Well, it seems like there are people that are part of the covenant. They're connected to Christ in some way. And I would say they are in the new covenant in some way. They're not regenerate though, so they don't produce fruit.
Yeah.
And that is ultimately proved out when you have a branch and you're like, where's the fruit? This is a grapevine. There's no fruit. It gets cut off or broken off and it gets thrown away into the fire. Damnation. And so there are people that are connected to the vine in some way that apostatize and then they're thrown into the fire. Yeah. And so I read that and I'm like, I don't think that the new birth and new covenant is quite as clean as you're making it. And so ultimately that was like the thing that was keeping me a Baptist, a Credo Baptist. And when I started looking at some of these apostasy passages, ultimately I had to say, I don't think that that's a very good argument. Yep. And so that was just one of the linchpins amongst years of thought and discussion and reading. It's not something that I came to quickly. It's not like I watched Doug Wilson something on YouTube and was like,
a video. Yeah.
I'm going to baptize my children.
Yep.
No, these decisions, especially because I'm not a free agent.
Right.
I'm not just like a guy coming to a church, that has a family. I have hundreds of people that I'm responsible for leading. And so these decisions have a lot of gravity.
Yep.
Especially when you've changed your mind before, going back to the first question. When you've had to change your mind before in leading people through that, the cost is unbelievably high.
Yes.
People will hate you. They will malign your character.
Yeah.
They will start competing churches that exist as the we're not them church.
Yeah, sure.
And there are gossip mills that exist because of a lot of these things. And so I just preface that as saying, like, we don't make these decisions flippantly.
No, we do not.
So, what about you, Brian?
Very similar. Very similar.
Veggie Tales.
A lot of Veggie Tales. God is bigger than the boogeyman. I mean, for real, no cap.
FR.
Dan's, this is why you need video. Dan's shaking his head.
I don't want you to say that.
His beard is wagging at me.
I'm wagging my beard.
Yeah, he's like, no. Okay, so a few things. I was convinced of a Presbyterian form of government before I was convinced of Presbyterian covenant theology.
That is true.
Yes. We had long, as a church, permitted or received people who were not just Paedo-Baptists, but had only received baptism as an infant into membership and communion at our church. We'd already done that. We've long had a population or a percentage of the congregation then that have been Presbyterians. Sometimes multiple, like third-generation Presbyterians, just we've always been Presbyterian. Sometimes new Presbyterians, sometimes people who weren't, and then they became them during their stay at our church.
That should also give you an idea of the pulse of the Presbyterian church in Utah.
Yeah. So you look in Utah, again, people who aren't in our context won't fully get. If you are anything Reformed at all, any kind of confessionally Reformed, whether London Baptist, Westminster, anything, you have very few options, right? You're going to look around. And then when you start to get into some issues where some London confessors are much closer to some Westminster confessors around other issues like patriarchy, how to engage the culture, Christian education. So there's a London confessing church. close to ours that is utterly unlike us, even though we overlap in a lot of our confessional theology pretty directly, because they would anathematize what we say about education or say that it's absolutely binding conscience, it's wicked, it's legalism, it's, I'm a cult leader, all these things. On paper, we overlap 80+%. And, but they hate our guts. So if you're somebody who leans on a lot of these issues our way, and you're and you're even now, let's say you're 1689 confessor, you don't like that I baptize babies or sprinkle, but you're going to be like, there's not a ton of options. You might end up at our church. So
it's the best of bad options, right?
That's what that's what we aim to be. We aim to be the best of the worst.
The best of the worst.
No, you just
Dan should be in charge of the church marketing.
Yeah,
we're the best of the worst.
No,
looking at our demographic matters, and it does affect things. We've always, we would go with the reformers, and we would receive Roman Catholic infant baptism for purposes of membership. That kind of thing. So we've always been somewhat strange as a Baptist church. We've always taken exception from the language of the 1689 with respect to the mode, where before I became a Paedo-Baptist, I had already been convinced by various passages of Scripture that immersion was not the only permissible mode of baptism, but that immersion, pouring, or sprinkling were all valid modes of water baptism.
Fire hose.
Yeah, fire hose. Oh, boy. It's COVID squirt gun. Not sure about that. But no, really, though, that was, I had become convinced of that from just looking at the nature of the word, for baptize, washing. We're not immersing a couch. There's no clear, verse in the Scriptures that demand immersion. As much as I've read the arguments, I'm just not convinced by them. So dominoes fall there. Very much convinced of that kind of Donaltian federalism, that London Baptist and 1689 federalism view. Had some critiques about some issues with, classic, is the new covenant mixed or unmixed? As Dan said, can you be in the new covenant in any sense and not be regenerate and elect? And I think, I know our Baptist brothers have answers to these. I don't want them to think we're straw-manning them. To me, it's utterly clear that you can be in the new covenant in some sense.
Externally,
with respect to its external administration, not be elect, not be regenerate, be broken off. And the reason I say that is, again, John 15, the branches aren't duct taped to the vine. They don't just appear to be connected to the vine. They have to be broken off in Jesus' vernacular. I'm not going way out on a limb here interpreting the because sometimes you can take symbolic language and press it way further than it's meant to. But I think you're understanding it precisely if you say Jesus is talking about different types of branches all connected to the same thing. I look at the Hebrew apostasy passages, and to steal from Pastor Douglas Wilson, I don't think the apostasy warnings are like beware of cliff signs in the middle of Kansas.
And that's actually, in Baptist theology, that was one of the other things that I didn't mention. Like Tom Schreiner, I think, was teaching at the time that, these are hypothetical warnings. It's like a cliff sign, but there aren't actually any cliffs.
It is a means of God's preservation of his saints.
But you can't actually...
And I am just not persuaded of that view. Some of these guys, and there's more, again, this was years and hours of conversation. So it wasn't any one pastor, any one book. It wasn't any... In fact, I read quite a few of the Presbyterian books early on, and I was like, I'm not convinced by these.
Well, that was actually one of the early things for me, and there's great writers on both sides of this issue, but I read Sean Wright's book on baptism, Believer's Baptism, as a Baptist, and I read it, and I was like, I don't know, I'm not really buying this.
Yeah.
I was a Baptist, a fully convinced Baptist. I read that, and that was one of the first things that kind of sent me saying, I want to see the other side of this.
And here's another one. So last week I tweeted that my children were holy from the moment of their existence, their conception, that because they were children of believers, they were holy in a way that Muslim children, Hindu children, et cetera, were not. I ended up deleting that tweet, guys, not because I disagree with it, but because since the modesty thing, I've never had so many libs trying to cancel me. And at one point I was like, we have had a lot going on in the church pastorally. And so
No time for that.
I didn't have time for the blocking and the whatnot. So I was like, I'm not going to deal with this. I'm just going to delete it so that they can't keep tagging me in it. And I saw that Dr. White had addressed it on the Dividing Line. I've never listened to an episode of the Dividing Line. I have not listened to this one either. But from my understanding from other people listening to it, Dr. White seems to think that I was talking about some kind of baptismal regeneration or not even baptismal, I guess, but as if they were holy in the sense they're justified, they're elect, they're regenerate, which is not what I meant. I meant what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7:14, that the children of one or more believers are holy. And I understand that Dr. White takes the position of the legitimacy view of that passage, which is a common and fine view of the passage. There are arguments in its favor. If I didn't hold the view I hold, that would be the second in line view. In my understanding, I think it's the second strongest interpretation of that passage. Where I fall away from it,
AKA
again,
the first loser.
the first loser. No, exactly.
You're not first,
I'm not
you're
convinced
last.
by it. But again,
Let's be real.
where I disagree with that interpretation is, again, a reason, one of the same connected reasons why I ended up embracing a Presbyterian view of the covenants. And it is because I think it does violence to the passage to say, as Dr. White did on Twitter, that what Paul is saying means that the children of Muslims are holy in the same way he's saying the children of believers are holy, in that if their marriage is legitimate, they're not bastards, they're born in a legitimate marriage, then they're holy. And to me, I think that does violence to the text. I think that Paul is quite clear that he's saying something that is peculiar to Christian believers because they are believers. And the thing I think he's saying is that they are holy in that they are a part of the external administration of the covenant. In the same way that if you were born in the covenant nation in the Old Testament, you were a part of the holy nation. You were corporately holy. And you belonged to that body. You needed new birth. You needed regeneration, as our children do. What I'm talking about, guys, is classic Westminsterian Presbyterian covenant theology.
Yeah, you see the same thing in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Mm-hmm. Like, read the book as a cohesive unit. Yep. They all passed through the sea.
Yeah.
They even drank from the rock that was Christ.
Yeah, they were baptized.
And God was not pleased with most of them.
Yeah. For the project of this season to be successful, the project of seeing a new Christendom built, there will need to be thousands and thousands of Christian men and women who are equipped to stand for the truth of Scripture against the errors of both the liberal church and the pagan culture. This is one reason we're so glad to be partnering with our sponsor for this season, Reformation Heritage Books. Reformation Heritage Books offers a large selection of helpful and theologically rigorous resources on everything from biblical theology to history to blue-collar family discipleship, the type of library and resources that could make the kind of men and women I just described, grounded in the rich heritage of the Reformed faith. We'd like to highlight one resource in particular, their Family Worship Bible Guide, that presents rich devotional thoughts on all 1,189 chapters of the Bible, including searching questions to promote conversation and to help you in leading your family in such a way as to say with Joshua, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Tap the link in the description of this episode to pick one up today. So I think a lot of us share similar root reasons. A lot of it has to do with the status of children as something different from the children of pagans. I've always objected, even when I was a particular Baptist, in the strongest terms, would object to the statement that our children are vipers in diapers, or that our children, literally, people were arguing with me last week. They're like, no, our children are pagans. They're heathens. Yeah. And I think that biblically, the biblical authors would say that's nonsense. I don't believe that's the case. I also think
it's, and I feel like I can say this having been a Baptist in those camps, I think most of those people are just heinously inconsistent too. That was kind of my feeling, was like, you don't actually treat your kid like a pagan.
No. Yeah, and that was part of the litmus test. When somebody came to me, we're making this transition in the church, mm-hmm. and they're like, well, I just don't see how you could get there. They're not convinced, like, I'm not going to do a debate with James White, style with the congregant that's sitting across from me, who just hears like regular teaching. He reads his Bible every day.
Yeah.
the thing that's most convincing to them, I'm not trying to change their mind necessarily in the moment. I'm just trying to show them, hey, this is how I think about it. And it has to do with a lot of what you said. You don't treat your child like you do the short-haired butch lesbian at work. Like you're teaching your children how to pray. You're teaching them how to worship. You're teaching them to memorize
You're
scripture.
teaching them to obey the scriptures.
Absolutely.
And when they do, so there were a few guys at Southern Seminary. I remember Don Whitney saying this. Don was trying to be consistent because he recognized that there was inconsistency. So Don said, when my children pray, I teach them to pray, and when they finish, I tell them, God did not hear you.
Yeah.
You're
See,
a pagan.
I think that man is a monster.
I think that's actually a wicked thing.
If that's what he said, yeah, I don't think, again, we're not straw manning you Baptists. I know most of you wouldn't say anything like that.
But I think that picture's like...
But it's an example of the tension that I resolve biblically by seeing this continuity of status between the Old and the New Covenant, this continuity of category, continuity of typology, a continuity that I think would have required some serious explanation in the New Testament that this feature had changed, and what I think would have resulted in serious argument early in the church history that we would have record of when they changed from the apostolic teaching of immersion baptism for professors only to infant baptism. I think we would see a record of debate in the early church, in the first 5 centuries of the church, that is absent from the record. Argument from silence, I totally understand.
It's an argument from silence. But there is no such thing as a legitimate argument from silence.
We heard that once, and it's actually not true. An argument from silence is a probabilistic argument. So it has, by its nature, it's not saying that it proves deductively that something is true.
Yeah.
But it just says it's more likely than not that this silence is explained by this fact. It's up for debate, but it's just one brick.
I'm just going to say there's more evidence for the existence of dragons than there is for the debate of baptism.
Dragons are 100% real. I mean, Psalm 91,
dragons,
for example, right there.
One
Psalm
of the things
144
that I wanted to say that I thought was cool is we're talking about 2 views on baptism, and again, we've been on both sides of it. One thing I think is cool in our church is the ability to talk about these things in a non-hostile way.
I'm gonna kill you.
Yeah. Or like, I still have Baptist friends in my life who are like trying to stick me in the side with a dagger. Like they're like, I would never let my daughter marry your son because he is infant baptized and therefore a pagan. Like they'll say things like that. And I'm like, okay, dude, chill. So overall, I know there's been a lot of hubbub, the cross-politics stuff, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. Overall, I would say this. On this issue, we're brothers. Mm-hmm. Lighten up, Francis.
We love you guys.
Let's just lighten up.
Yeah.
We love each other.
Guess what's going to happen in church this Sunday?
Same team. And everybody in our church gets along.
What's going to happen this Sunday?
This Sunday in our church, we're going to baptize 3 Christians who are Christians by profession. We're going to immerse them. Their parents are Credo Baptists. We're going to baptize 3 other, it's actually funny, it's the same number. We're going to baptize 3 other children.
This will be like the 3rd time we've done this?
Yeah, whose parents are Pedo Baptists. And we're going to get along. And at the end of that,
no one's mouth will be frothy.
As a church, we're going to stand and we're going to charge them, for you, Christ died, for you. And we're going to give them the congregational charge. We're going to love one another. And we're going to agree. Here's the point that I think is most important. The thing I'm more convinced of than any other aspect in this debate is that we should get along. Because I can step into the particular Baptist framework. I can answer the problem passages from their perspective, that all the passages we brought up. I can give what used to be to me a persuasive response and remains persuasive to many Christians. They can say, on the regulative principle, there is no command to baptize infants, therefore you cannot require me to baptize infants. And I would say, sure, okay, I love you. I think what you're saying is Christian theology. We disagree about some of these things. These are in the weeds things. And I can now, of course, I'm convinced by the view, obviously, I can step into the Presbyterian covenant theological framework and I can answer the problem passages that a particular Baptist would bring to me persuasively, and obviously to many. Where I really strongly react is, and this is, to be fair, more common from particular Baptists, just because of the nature of their view. I really strongly have a problem with the idea that there basically was very little actual baptism for maybe 1,000 years. I think that's a very difficult position to sustain in a non-restorationist manner.
Yeah.
So I have a real problem with barring the table from John Calvin or barring him membership. And obviously, even as a particular Baptist, had that reaction because we allowed infant baptized Presbyterians in membership. So this has clearly been an area where we never were fully 1689. To be fair, someone's going to say you weren't 1689. You took exception on these two key areas. I'm like,
On baptism.
We did. On mode of baptism. We still baptize by immersion, and we would never have performed an infant baptism. But so again, like, I love Tom Askell. I love my particular Baptist brothers and sisters. I don't think that they are guilty of many of the errors of revivalism and individualism that have been shot through popular evangelical Baptist culture that have been, I'm talking about pop Arminian dominant SBC culture. I would not accuse my particular Baptist brothers of those errors. Like, no, I don't.
Who
I
would
don't
have thought
think
he's such a winsome guy?
I know.
So you guys-
You'd see his Twitter and you'd think the guy's a real jerk.
People really do actually, I think, have a wildly inaccurate view of what I'm like.
You're just too serrated edge for me.
Even when I read my Twitter, I go back and I'm like, I don't feel like most of this is hammer stuff. Anyway, you're way more of a hammer than me.
What
Eric.
other tool is there?
Both of you guys are just really sweet men.
Yeah,
Sweet.
we are sweet. I'm the sweet psalmist of Ogden, according to the Carpenter King of Maine. So
Yeah, well,
Dovetail
Dyer, Carpenter King of Maine. Okay, next question. This is somewhat related. I thought this was a very interesting question from Aaron Baer of the Undragoned podcast. He says, in one of the early episodes, you guys lay out a definition of Reformed Catholicity. This is a lot of what we're talking about, getting along. This is my comments. Getting along across Reformed differences, like even baptism stuff. Continuing, he says, a guy you commonly refer back to, and I think you mentioned wanting him to be a guest of some sort, is Esselin. He's referring to Anthony Esselin. So question, what is your justification for promoting Reformed Catholicity while heavily utilizing a Roman Catholic? I'm doing some interpretation because he uses the acronym RC for Reformed Catholicity, and that also happens to be an acronym for Roman Catholicism.
but he spelled that out.
So Aaron, if we got this question wrong, Kurt, feel free to tweet at us. But I think he's saying, what's your justification for promoting Reformed Catholicity while heavily utilizing a Roman Catholic? To think of it a little more broadly, in the face of an increasingly syncretist church, how can your vision of Reformed Catholicity stay faithful when grabbing and promoting ideas from individuals outside the tent of Reformed Catholicity?
So my immediate response to this is I don't think all Roman Catholics are outside the tent of Reformed Catholicity. Agree, disagree.
Depends what you mean.
Yeah, it depends on the guy.
I think everyone would say it depends on what you...
Yeah.
Like, is the Roman Catholic theology former or proper heretical in a false gospel?
Which one?
I think yes. Like the doctrine of salvation in Trent, Council of Trent. Yeah, I think it's. Yeah. I think their Marian dogma is clearly heretical. I would say purgatory is a wildly unbiblical, fanciful view. I think their sacramentology is, which is obviously a part of their soteriology, because we're talking about infusions of grace through these. I think those are very problematic. I do think there are regenerate people in the Roman Catholic tent. That's what I would say.
But to his point, it's a fair. They're not reformed,
right? They're not.
If I'm reading his RC, I think that's what he means by RC.
Yeah, I think so.
They're not reformed.
Yeah.
But I guess So I'm saying they're not reformed.
Obviously, they're not reformed.
Right, and I think
we would say, Peter Lightheart has made this point even that we're trying to bring it all back together.
I would love to see the Roman Catholic Church repent and be reunited. Yeah, absolutely. We're all aiming for that in a non and I think a lot shallow of ecumenicism. Christians. So to his what I think Aaron's getting at is that one of the things that we would criticize is this syncretism, where you're like taking all these different things and mashing them together in this like lowest common denominator pop faith, pop secular spiritual ecumenicalism. Yeah. Absolutely, that's anathema. We want highbrow theology. We want it to be biblical. We want it to be cask strength. All of that's true. And on those things, if Anthony Esselin and us sat down and started talking about Mary, the papal system, soteriology, you would hear us disagreeing with Anthony. I'm sure. But the things that we tell you guys, hey, Anthony's really good on this, or Eslin's really good on this, they're not about those doctrines. They're about his cultural commentary. So I'd appeal to him in the same way that I would appeal to a professor of history who does really good work, like to the same way I'd say Paul Johnson has excellent work on American history. And I actually don't know if Paul Johnson is a Christian or not. He probably is, or was. I think he's gone.
I don't know.
But
man.
that's the interesting question.
Yeah.
Is are we allowed to read authors outside of our immediate tradition?
Yeah.
And find valuable things from them? I think the issue is you have to have discernment.
Yes.
You have to apply the things that are really good. I mean, I read Pat Buchanan. I think Pat's also Roman Catholic.
I think you're right, but I can't say it with confidence. I'll look it up.
So, great stuff there as well from Pat. I'm not going to not read him just because he's a Roman Catholic. Again, I mean, even with people within the Reformed Catholicity, Reformed camp, we would say, yeah, I mean, I definitely don't agree with, a lot of things that a lot of people say, social theory, those sorts of things. Yeah. So I think we need to get away from this idea that reading a guy and saying this thing about a guy is good is a carte blanche endorsement of everything. And if we had to only endorse people or only, mention people that we fully endorsed everything,
yeah,
I mean, that would be almost no one.
Well, I mean, look at, the thing is, we'd be saying, well, Lutherans are out, baptismal regeneration, so are Anglicans. Brandon Meeks is out, baptismal regeneration. So are a lot of the fathers that taught baptismal regeneration of some sort. You start looking at, that's just one issue, and you go, yep, they're out. I mean, I guess we can't promote or talk about them. And I think that that's a mistake. I think it's a mistake also when you fail to recognize that historically, if you're going to talk about Reformed Catholicity in a historic way, you're going to have to recognize that the true church, and I mean the elect, has been intermingled throughout all sorts of problematic systems and groups throughout history. And that, like we have a classical Christian school. A huge amount of the classical Christian schooling tradition comes from the education of monks and priests, of clergy, in a lot of ways, Roman Catholic system. It's not until we get to, the Reformation that you start to see, and actually I do think that's a good example of where Protestant scholars took and actually corrected some of the errors of Roman Catholicism, and ended up saying things like we should actually educate more people than just clergy and noblemen because of the priesthood of all believers. And that was a doctrinal correction that Protestantism brought to the classical tradition and improved it. I think we see the fruit of that today in many ways. So I think we'd all probably agree there that we're not saying you should swim the Tiber by saying Anthony Eslin's a guy you should read.
No, I mean, just like if we recommend, like, hey, you should read Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life. It's got some really helpful insights in there. I wouldn't take your theological instruction.
Don't become Jungian.
No, I mean, that's not the goal, but you steal wisdom from the plunder of the Egyptians, So that's how I'd approach a lot of these guys. It's really helpful to know the author, the time period that it was written, the particular ditches that they're going to fall into.
Yeah.
I mean, like I was talking to Brian the other day about reading a certain Victorian era person, and they're like, yeah, eugenics were actually like a thing at the time.
Yeah.
So you have to be aware of that. Rousseauian romanticism.
Yep.
Things like that. You just have to be aware when you're reading. It's just part of being discerning when you're reading these people.
Well, I wonder if I could ask, there's another question on here.
Yeah.
And maybe we close with it.
Yeah.
Because we're at that mark. This is from Jordan, and he says, how do you decide, I'm assuming this is a guy, sorry if you're a girl, how do you decide...
It is a guy, by the way.
Okay. How do you decide when to cut ties and when to be co-belligerent? I'm often surprised who gets praise and who gets criticism. Maybe I'm reading too much into the criticism, though. For example, Mahaney and Piper get criticism, Elon Musk gets praise.
Yeah, I was actually going to read that one next. I thought it was such a good question.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Brilliant minds thinking alike.
And I was also going to, this is funny, we didn't plan it, so I was also going to say, hey guys, for our last question.
Oh, nice.
So look at us, Eric. We're locked in right now across the King's Hall table.
It's cute.
Pilot
So
and
cute.
co-pilot Stan.
Yeah, man. So, what's going on there? Why do we? We've said some things critical of Piper with pietism. We've said some critical things of Mahaney. We, promoted in one of our cold opens. We told a story from Elon Musk and made a positive application from it. If I could take a crack at it,
I was wondering.
I was going to say it was silent.
Like, yeah, I got something.
Yeah, and then I'll pass it over to Dan. The first thing I'll say, and I'll just keep it very narrow because there's more, but would be that in the same way that in Jesus' parables, sometimes he's using examples like the dishonest manager and then draws a positive point from the dishonest manager. That's the category I would put our praise, quote unquote, of Elon Musk, where we're pointing at something that is good and virtuous. He's an image bearer of God. He has a conscience. Even those who do not know the Lord bear witness to the universality of God's morality in this creation by obeying the law without the law, right? So Elon Musk worked really hard, took risks, did manly, courageous things that are not righteous in the sense that they're not unmixed with sin and they're coming from a place of an unregenerate heart. So they don't merit favor with God. Elon Musk isn't going to get into heaven because God looks at him and says, Elon, you did really good with that, spaceship thing. So come on in, right? We're not saying that. We're using him in a parabolic sort of way in that instance. So pass it over to Dan. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I have a couple of thoughts. First, the subject matter of the podcast is New Christendom, right? The next Christendom, building Christendom. And so you're going to be looking at Christian leaders, Christianity in itself. Are we adopting an Elon Musk model of, is he informing New Christendom? Like, no, he's not part of the foundations of New Christendom. Just like you said, he's a useful example for some of these ideas. He's actually a evil man. He is, it's weird that I brought up eugenics because that's why he has so many kids with so many different women is because he wants his genetics into the human gene pool.
Yeah,
because he thinks pretty highly of himself. I mean, he is the wealthiest man in the world. So anyway, I mean, the guy's actually quite evil. So I say that. The second thing is you also have spheres of authority. Mm-hmm. So Elon Musk, is he an authority over the church? No. I mean, just like if this was a political podcast, if he was a head of or had responsibility in the sphere of the state, he would receive a lot of criticism.
Yeah.
Because he's going to be the subject matter of what we're looking at. And he has certain responsibilities. He's just a businessman right now. And so men like Mahaney and Piper are going to get criticized because we're the subject matter and the responsibility that they have is in the sphere of the church. And so it would make sense that we were going to look at them closer than we would look at Elon Musk. We're not going to take him seriously as far as New Christendom. Like what part does, maybe he repents and funds the thing. I don't know, but he's not even somebody worth taking seriously in this project.
He could Starlink us some better internet so it doesn't take so long to upload the King's Hall video to YouTube.
Yeah.
That'd be great. Elon.
I mean, sure.
Point one of your satellites this way, man.
Okay.
Well,
do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, so I was thinking of something that Brian said based on the Gospels. And again, please don't take this too far. It's not a one-to-one, but, we have like a Pharisee and a publican. The publican in Jesus' story is like being celebrated for true repentance. And the guy, so Jesus tells these stories that are kind of like, they flip things on their head. Mm-hmm. So why do I talk about John Piper and pietism so much? Because I think that's such a critical issue that we get wrong.
Yeah.
I think also people don't hear me often saying positive things. The other day, I was talking about how John Piper's preaching on suffering is some of the best preaching I think I've ever heard.
Yeah.
On a topic. I still think his pietism stuff has done a lot of damage in the church. And I don't even think that John Piper is necessarily meaning to do that damage.
No, he's very sincere.
He's a very sincere
He's not
guy.
a grifter.
No, I don't see him that way at all.
Yeah.
I've taken, I guess, criticism for criticizing John Piper from some people. Same with C.J. Mahaney. I don't know these guys personally. I'm just, kind of reporting a lot of the things that we've seen publicly. Mm-hmm. I think Mahaney came up in Big Fast and Famous. And then to Dan's point, like it's odd that sometimes. So I'm looking at what are the main issues affecting the church, And what I happen to see is a lot of the main issues evangelical leaders are getting wrong.
Yeah.
And a lot of the main issues, in some ways, people like Jordan Peterson are getting more right than the evangelical establishment. There's a lot of issues like masculinity. I know that he's a Jungian atheist, and that's why it's so sad that Jordan Peterson is better than Russell Moore.
Mm.
So I think sometimes we're using that kind of foil of like, man, you'd think somebody within the church would have something positive to say on these issues. And yet, in the same way that the Gospels do this, people on the outside seem to get it, people on the inside don't.
Yeah.
It's a little bit of that interplay. And again, I just go back to this. Read with discernment.
Mm-hmm.
We're not endorsing, Jordan Peterson and everything that he says.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously we've criticized so some of this comment I don't even think is totally fair. Like, we blasted Jordan Peterson in the Daily Wire.
We did. I forgot about that.
Dave Rubin stuff.
Yeah, we did.
So where criticism is due, you'll receive it, and where praise is due, you'll receive it.
Yeah. And all of it's going to be from our assessment with the data we have. And of course, you are free to make arguments that we've gotten this or that wrong. That's what we do all day. I mean, not all day, but I mean, this is what the work of theology and culture entails, is brothers getting together and saying, I think this is true, and someone saying, I don't think that's quite it, and here's why. And you work and you sharpen one another and you end up with truth. We're not handing this podcast down from on high as the inerrant word of God. This is our attempts at saying, here are some important things, a worthy end that we're aiming, that we think you should aim for and point your sails into. Yeah, let's build the new Christendom. And this is where we think it's gone wrong. Here's where we think it could be improved. We're going to have more to say through the season. And we'd invite your criticisms. We'd invite your conversation and your feedback. So that's going to be about it for this episode, but I think we'll do this again. We've got actually quite a few more really good questions on the list. We're just out of time for today. So expect another one of these episodes in the near future. Lord willing, working through some of your questions, and because you guys have had some really good ones that I think particularly some we didn't get to in getting even more blue collar in applying some of the principles that we've been expounding in this season. So keep them coming. We do, of course, want to thank our sponsors for this episode. One of them, actually, I just saw a guy on Twitter tweet, hey, Reformation Heritage Books, Bible Worship Study Guide that we've been encouraging you guys to check out this season. They're like, it's the best resource I have on my shelf. And I'm like, yeah, amen. So go check them out. Check out Reformation Heritage Books. We have a link in the description of the show. Check out Christendom Bible College for some guys that are doing good work in promoting robust Christian higher education. But thanks for listening. And as always, remember, Winkit Quisa Winkit, he conquers who conquers himself. See you next time.